I'm Susanna Lipscomb. I'm a historian and I'm fascinated by the history of the royal family.
I'm not just interested in the pomp and circumstance, but in the less respectable side of the story.
I mean, this is just shocking. This is shocking.
From medieval to modern times, our monarchs have been at the centre of scandals throughout history.
I want to understand what makes a scandal.
The public would be absolutely astonished at the level of involvement that the royal family have.
And what role the press, parliament and the public played in generating outrage and rumour.
Who do you think did it?
I'll be investigating some stories you might know and some you might never have heard of. He feels like the key suspect. Absolutely. But at the time, they were the talk of the town.
There's very few people that could survive in a 19th century asylum.
Sorry, it's awful.
From marriages to infidelity, opulence to suspicious deaths, I want to discover
How bad judgment, bad behaviour, or even bad luck led to some of history's biggest royal scandals. Monarchs have always used their wealth to enhance their power and dignity. Looking like a king or queen is a crucial part of the job. But there's always been a question about where all the money to pay for that magnificence comes from, how, on what, and on whom they're spending it, and whether it's really their wealth at all. And what's the line between upholding the dignity of the crown and needless extravagance?
It's a question that feels very timely. With a new monarch on the throne, who's talked of wanting to streamline the royal family, the question of the value of the royals feels particularly pertinent. But our attitude to royal flamboyance has changed over the course of history, and discussions about the value of the monarchy are actually quite recent.
If you think about it, most people believed the monarch is chosen by God to be king or queen and head of the church. So then cost-benefit analysis is not appropriate. But oddly, now that is exactly the kind of language that's being used. The cost of the monarchy per person in Britain per year comes out as something like 82 pence a person or something like that, which they're very proud of. They think it sounds like great value for money, but it does move away from this mystic, the monarchy is beyond discussion type approach and makes it more like buying apples in a shop.
In the modern world, where we count royal budgets down to the pennies, the monarchy are more susceptible to scandal than ever. Retired royal correspondent Stephen Bates knows all about the delicate balance which the royal family have to maintain.
There's a sense in which people want the royals to be kind of magnificent and they enjoy the pageantry that goes with them, but they worry about where the money's coming from.
Well, that's certainly true. They want the pomp and circumstance and the fancy uniforms, but they don't like the thought that they're actually paying for it themselves.
And what has been thought to be too much?
Ostentatiousness is the thing. Prince Andrew always used to be known as Air Miles Andy because he would take a helicopter to a golf match. On official business? I don't think so. That sort of extravagance is very much frowned upon. One reason why the Queen was so admired was that plastic box of Weetabix on the breakfast table, the fact that occasionally, under very staged conditions, she went on public transport. The royals need to be sensitive to that all the time.
As a society, we're far more questioning of perceived overspending by royals than we used to be. But back through the centuries, the general population didn't have that much say over how a royal used their money, even in cases of extreme overindulgence. But even a monarch who was not known for taking the feelings of others into account could go too far.
renowned Tudor monarch Henry VIII had an extraordinarily lavish lifestyle. On his clothes alone, he spent the equivalent today of over £1 million a year. And on his first Christmas celebration as king, he splurged the equivalent of £13.5 million, most of his annual revenue, on food, entertainment and gifts.
Perhaps the best example of this extravagance is the 3-week peace summit cum party that was known as the Field of Cloth of Gold. This happened in June 1520. Henry VIII met with the French king, Francois I, on English soil in northern France. And they celebrated the fact that they had made peace. Each had with them a retinue of 6,000 people, and we know they were all housed in tents of cloth of gold. Cloth of gold is made from actual spirals of gold through which the fabric, the silk, is threaded. Henry, of course, had to do one better. He had a temporary palace thrown up of brick and glass and timber. It was 300 square feet. There was jousting, there was feasting. The food for the English alone cost £8,839, 2 shillings and 4 pence. That's the equivalent of about £4.6 million today.
As well as a lavish feast, the guests were treated to huge wine fountains, which ran freely for hours at a time. And when you step inside the first courtyard at Hampton Court, you get a glimpse of that Tudor revelry.
This is a faithful recreation of the fountain that was erected in front of Henry VIII's palace at the Field of Cloth of Gold. And it's an amazing one because at the very top, you've got a figure of Bacchus, the god of wine, sitting on a wine barrel and drinking his fill, because this was a fountain that ran with wine, which is why it says, make good cheer who wishes, and even the same in the French, fais gaucher qui voudra. And everyone's taking it quite seriously. This poor chap shows you what happens if you have too much. But look at that man over there. He's being sick.
Clearly, no expense was spared in the festivities. But what was the point of all this spending in the name of peace? The two kings didn't just want to outdo each other. By displaying their wealth so ostentatiously, they were also hinting that, should they want to, they had plenty of money to go into battle again.
Which is precisely what happened. Within 2 short years, England and France were at war again. The campaigns of 1522 and 1523 in France cost £400,000. That's the equivalent of £208 million today. And the money for it was raised by loans, short-term enforced loans on the general public that Henry promised he would repay, but never did. When in 1525 Henry wanted to invade France again, he sent his right-hand man, Thomas Wolsey, to send commissioners out to the provinces to ask for another additional tax.
The people of England were scandalised by Henry's request.
In Kent, one commissioner reports that people were saying, despite the infinite sums of money the king hath spent on the campaign, he hath not 1 foot more land in France than his noble father had. In Cambridge, people refused to pay. In Suffolk, there was a full-scale revolt. So Henry didn't go to war in 1525, but he hardly stopped spending. This is what he spent his money on in the 1530s. Tens of thousands of pounds, millions of pounds today, building palaces like this one at Hampton Court.
Next, I explore the home of the biggest spender in royal history.
Wow.
And reveal his mind-boggling amount of debt.
That's £23 million. Yes.
When we look back to some of our monarchs from centuries ago, like Henry VIII, it might appear that money was simply no object. But some of the most extravagant royals in history have found their bank balances and their reputations in serious danger. Perhaps none so much as George IV. What many people probably know about George IV comes from Hugh Laurie's depiction of him as the dim and self-absorbed Prince Regent in Blackadder, barely tolerated by his manservant. Unfortunately for George, the lack of respect that his butler has for him there was pretty much what most of his subjects felt about him in real life. George was one of the least popular royals in the whole of British history. In his youth, as the Prince of Wales, he was viewed as lazy and ill-suited to the hard work of state matters, preferring a debauched and very expensive lifestyle. Much to the annoyance of his father, George III, the Prince of Wales liked to spend his time with those who drank and gambled. Even in his youth, he accrued vast debts, which were caused chiefly by his absolute commitment to the finer things in life. Besides partying, George's other passions included architecture and design. When the young prince came of age in 1783, his father gave him Carlton House as his London residence, along with a huge renovation budget to keep him occupied, and perhaps to try and instill a sense of responsibility in his wayward son. Little did he know that his generosity would rather have the opposite effect on George, who wasn't one to compromise on budget when it came to his artistic vision. I've come to Brighton Pavilion, one of George's greatest surviving building projects, to meet curator Dr. Alexandra Loska, to get a taste of George's appetite for extravagance.
Wow. This is incredible. What we see here is almost a complete vision. This is George. This is his take on chinoiserie, this sort of very flamboyant, very playful style, taking inspiration from other cultures. And if you put to one side for a second how much it cost, you think, this is his personality inscribed on the walls. The flair George manifested in his building projects was matched only by the seriously decadent parties he hosted. He didn't accede to the crown until the age of 57, leaving him with decades of time to kill and plenty of opportunities to entertain. What the Pavilion Brighton was always about inviting people, wining and dining and singing and dancing. And you can really tell what is most important to George, because the two largest rooms are the banqueting room and at the other end of the building, the music room. But unsurprisingly, places like Carlton House and Brighton Pavilion didn't come cheap. The chandelier alone in the pavilion's banqueting room cost £5,000. To put that in perspective, a maid at the time would have earned £50 a year. Perhaps the best example of George's spending habits is the pavilion's jaw-droppingly elaborate music room. This was probably the most expensive room to furnish, to decorate, and it cost at least £45,000. It's not building it, it's just decorating it. I mean, that would just be a mind-blowing amount to spend today on decorating a room, and this is in the 1820s. I mean, let's talk about these sums of money, because I can't quite get my head around them. So how much money was he given to live on? Well, he was the future King of England. He would have expected to have an income from Parliament, and he wanted £100,000 a year in 1783. His father, King George III, said, I will only give you 50,000, but you'll also have the income from the Duchy of Cornwall, and you may get some extras along the line for certain projects. So an income of £50,000 a year. I don't know what that is today. Do you have any? This is the National Archives currency converter. So where was 1780? 1783. I wouldn't say no to that today. 50,000 would be nice, wouldn't it? But let's see. 50,000 plus the money from the Duchy of Cornwall, so about 12,000. OK, £62,000. A mere £62,000 in 1780 is 5 million, 5.3 million, and yet that doesn't seem to be enough.
It's not enough for him.
It's hard to live on 5.3 million.
It's not enough for him, so he runs up debts. Within 3 years, he has racked up debts of £270,000.
Oh,
this is 1786.
1786. Computer says, let's see, £270,000. That's £23 million.
Yeah, and this is
£23 million.
And this is before he starts building the Royal Pavilion. So this is what he's doing in London and all his other hobbies.
For the Playboy prince to be spending such vast sums on such an excessive lifestyle caused more than a few raised eyebrows among the paying public.
Where is this money coming from? I mean, this isn't his money, is it? This belongs to the nation.
It is Parliament subsidising or, you know, financing the royal family, the monarchy. And he is in constant of discussions or arguments with Parliament and the King.
These arguments happening in the late 18th and early 19th centuries about how much Prince George deserved get to the very nub of what feels like a very modern issue. To what extent should the public be funding the lifestyles of the royal family?
Some people thought that the Prince of Wales was a private citizen and therefore his father should deal with him. Others argued that it was the obligation of the taxpayer to almost invest in him for his future because he was going to be king. So they weren't very clear what the distinction was between private and royal, private and public. And that problem continues on really to this day. When Windsor Castle went on fire, the public were presented with the bill. And there was a debate about why that was. More recently, Frogmore Cottage renovations for Meghan and Harry. The public paid for that. But then when they left royal service, they had to repay that sum of money. It's a question of why are we paying for these things? We don't get access to them. And that, again, is part of this complicated mess of working out what is royal and what is not royal.
While today's royals might be rather more discreet about their spending, Prince George clearly saw it as his right. By 1795, he'd racked up an astronomical £650,000 of debt, roughly 78 million in today's terms. He was mobbed by creditors in the street and reluctantly forced to marry his German cousin, Princess Caroline, to clear his debts. But George wasn't about to change his ways. He continued his spending spree for years, even after he finally became king in 1820, constantly extending and redecorating the building at Brighton, creating the extraordinary pavilion we know today.
This is the saloon. It's one of the most formal rooms.
That is rather wonderful, that silk, isn't it?
It's red and gold, and then in combination with silver. It's really unusual. It's bling.
It certainly is.
Bling, and it's really experimental bling, because if you create a silvered wall decoration, wallpaper, of course it will tarnish, and it did. So after a few years, all that silver went black.
Oh.
But George didn't care, because he would just replace it, or he would have come up with new schemes, with new ideas.
If this shows us George over 50 years, then he's spending through that entire period of time. There's no point at which he thinks, OK, enough is enough. Everything's great, I'll stop spending now. He just carries on. Think of the French Revolution. You've got people being beheaded for exactly this sort of excess just across the channel.
You're absolutely right, and I think maybe that's one of the reasons why he did it. You know, why not do it now? Why not enjoy life now? Because I don't know, I might lose my head too to the guillotine.
But while George was enjoying life in the outrageously opulent pavilion, what did the public think of his projects? Alexandra and I have access to Brighton Pavilion's archive rooms to find out what George's subjects thought of his excesses.
So, this is behind the scenes.
We are very much behind the scenes. We are in what was originally George's private bathroom.
Oh, fabulous.
And where we're standing now was basically a small swimming pool, a 10-foot deep plunge pool.
The man knew how to live. OK, and what are these? These are amazing cartoons.
Well, George had the great misfortune, or perhaps fortune, to live in the great, great age of political caricatures. So we have these incredibly funny, daring comments on political life, on society. And of course, George was fodder for the cartoonists, for the caricaturists of the time.
These are just fabulous because they just give us such insight into how people wanted to skewer him at the time. I mean, this one, we've got to talk about this one.
Yes.
This is fabulous.
It's George at the end of his life, really. He's by then, you know, obese, and he has various health issues. He sits on a teapot dressed like a Chinese mandarin, and that's, of course, a reference to where we are here in the Brighton Pavilion. Yeah. Behind him, you can see the Royal Pavilion. So, what's the teapot all about? Well, this is the Treasury teapot. This is where the money is coming from. And he's quite literally sitting on it, and it's spurting money. And what's he spending the money on? Well, the Royal Pavilion, changes to Buckingham Palace, also a giraffe. And the cartoonists call this his playthings. So he is a man who should be ruling the country and looking after his people. Instead, he's playing with a giraffe. And the giraffe, by the way, was a real giraffe. He kept this at Windsor Great Park.
It's just such an evocative image. In fact, he reminds me of the figure from Alice in Wonderland who sits and smokes his hookah pipe.
Quite.
But this is contemporary comment on it, and it's saying, look, he's not doing what he's supposed to do. He's just building and creating and designing, and he's having fun, but doesn't he have a job?
Exactly.
These cartoons vividly depict how George's indulgent and ostentatious lifestyle became the subject of public ridicule. By the end of his life, he grew morbidly obese, and suffering from severe gout, he never salvaged his wretched reputation.
When George died as King George IV in 1830, few of his subjects mourned his loss. There remains nothing to be said or done about George IV, wrote at the Times, except pay, as pay we must for his profusion.
Next, the medieval mistress who went from rags to riches and found herself in the midst of one of the biggest financial scandals of the 14th century.
She is the only woman who is put on trial in Parliament during the whole of the Middle Ages.
So far, I've seen how kings like Henry VIII and George IV flaunted their wealth. But some of the most scandalous financial debacles in history come not from the royals themselves, but from their mistresses. And to explore one of the most hotly debated of these stories, I need to go back to the Middle Ages.
One of the most infamous of all medieval women was the commoner Alice Paris. Once the Queen's lady-in-waiting, or damoiselle, she became mistress to the King, Edward III. Contemporaries explained this by reference to her as an avaricious harlot who used her influence with the king to manipulate him in his dotage into making her rich. Alice Paris certainly became an extremely wealthy woman, and she did so over quite a short period of time. The question is, how did she really go from nothing to being one of the richest people in the country?
It's easy to see where the money came from. Edward III was a very wealthy king who had repeatedly triumphed on the battlefield. His army captured dozens of French and Scottish royals and nobles, all of whom had to pay enormous ransoms to achieve their freedom. His wealth paid for building work at Windsor Castle and the original Palace of Westminster. But how so much of his money ended up in the hands of his mistress has been a scandal for centuries. The trouble with piecing together the story of Edward's mistress is that we just don't have that many accounts of Alice's life, and certainly very few neutral ones. Most of our information comes from the blatantly hostile writings of monks, specifically those at St Albans Cathedral.
One of the monks, the Abbey's precentor, Thomas Walsingham, compiled what is aptly known as the Chronicle of St Albans, although it's also more commonly known as the Scandalous Chronicle, because this is what he had to say about Alice. She was a shameless, impudent harlot and of low birth. She was not attractive or beautiful, but knew how to compensate for these defects by her seductive voice. Blind fortune elevated this woman to such heights and promoted her to a greater intimacy with the king than was proper. So, not exactly an impartial witness.
One person who has dedicated real time to investigating Alice's true character is Dr. Laura Tompkins, whose new research makes us reconsider this medieval mistress and whether she's been treated fairly by history.
Who was Alice Perris?
Well, Alice was a member of a family of London goldsmiths, and that's a relatively new discovery. Previously, because she was the king's mistress, it was presumed that she was a member of the nobility, or at very least the landed gentry. Yeah. But actually, say, she was from this London merchant family.
So how did someone from that sort of background become mistress to the king?
What we know is that actually her first husband, a man named Yanin Perez, he is described in one document as being the jeweller of the king. And it's possible that Alice met the king, therefore, through her first husband, perhaps assisting him with his business at court.
Unusually, as far as medieval kings go, Edward appears to have been loyal to his wife, Philippa of Hainault, for most of her life. But when Philippa became very ill in the 1360s, he began his affair with the young Alice. Alice bore 3 of the king's children, but it wasn't until Philippa's death in 1369 that Alice really started to profit from her association with the king. After the Queen died, Alice grew steadily richer and richer, as this medieval document housed at the National Archives reveals.
I have to tell you what a thrill it gives me just to sit next to this, because normally the sort of earliest people let me go is about the 16th century, and here we're sitting next to a document from 1372. It's amazing.
It's an incredible survival. This is 3 years after the Queen has died, and during this period, Alice is able to accumulate vast sums of money through her acquisition of land. Her estate amounted to over 150 different parcels of property, including over 70 manors. This is huge amounts, and it was probably somewhere in the region of £2,000 a year, which at the time made her one of the wealthiest individuals in the country. This is a charter in which Alice is actually giving land to Edward, and in return for this, she actually gets an even more valuable property, a manor called Wendover. And this document is particularly lovely because it still has her seal attached to it.
That's amazing.
So what is so fascinating about this document is that normally we would perhaps expect for mistresses to be only the recipients of gifts of land and jewels from the king. But what this is a great example of is how active Alice was as a businesswoman herself. She is actively engaged in these land transactions.
The court was outraged to see Edward publicly showering his low-born mistress with gifts so unashamedly. When in 1375 Alice appeared publicly in London, dressed in golden garments as the Lady of the Sun, the sense of injustice was complete. By the king's final years, Alice had become queen in all but name, leading to vicious rumours that she was manipulating an ageing and vulnerable Edward.
What's your reading of Alice in terms of her character?
She was an incredibly determined woman. I don't think she would necessarily be that popular even if she was around today. We don't know the accuracy of all the accusations that are made against her. We have a series of petitions essentially accusing her of seizing land through armed force, not paying debts on incredibly large scale, seizing people's property. And there's a great sense that comes across in all these documents that she did this in the knowledge that she was essentially untouchable through the law. But to come from the background that she did, to accumulate the amount of wealth that she did, shows an astonishing amount of drive, business sense, ambition, and there's a lot to be admired in her.
Ambition often is used about women in a negative way, but in this situation, she must have had something about her. She must have had charisma, intelligence, energy, you know, all of these things that make someone successful.
Absolutely. This is someone who's incredibly active and intelligent.
But Alice's heyday couldn't last forever. When King Edward died in 1377 and was succeeded by his grandson, Richard II, her fortunes changed dramatically.
So this is the Parliament roll from the first Parliament after Edward III dies. And the situation for Alice changes extremely rapidly. She is essentially found guilty of corruption. And because of that, she has the entirety of her state forfeited to the crown, and she is banished from the realm. She is the only woman who is put on trial in Parliament during the whole of the Middle Ages, which shows how unusual this was.
Gosh. So is this the indictment against her, all of this, the charges made against her?
What we have is a long account of, one by one, men at court who used to be her allies, men that she says in this account will speak for her and defend her. Instead, what they do is they take to the stand and they essentially, throw her under the bus. Now, under the new reign, they want to secure their own position.
So she's deprived of all her estates and is exiled. Is that the last we hear of her?
No, she does come back. So at this stage, she marries a man called Sir William Windsor, and he affords her some amount of protection. But what's really interesting is that he gets granted Alice's former properties rather than her being granted them directly. All of a sudden, you see a woman who has, for the whole of the time of her relationship with the king, been visible in the record and being able to operate as a single woman. Suddenly you feel the restrictions and the dangers of being part of a marriage.
Alice has gone down through the years as having this really dreadful reputation. Why do you think that is?
The main reason for this is that the main source of evidence that we have about her is written by monks who disapprove of Alice on many different levels. She gets accused of using witchcraft. There's a famous story by Thomas Walsingham that she steals the rings from Edward III whilst he's lying on his deathbed. And it's really those stories that give this really very cliched picture of, the manipulating mistress.
It's interesting, isn't it, that throughout the centuries, that cliche has come down to us, whether it's Alice Perris or Anne Boleyn or Wallis Simpson. It's the same picture that people impose on women. She must be a grasping woman out for everything she can get.
Absolutely. And really it is that sense of that threat to the social order.
There's no doubt that Alice Perris was a brilliant, sometimes ruthless businesswoman, and was probably not always easy to deal with. But in this case, the real outrage seems to have been caused not by the business deals themselves, but who was doing them. Men of status found the idea that a woman of low birth could have real influence over a king's financial affairs deeply unpalatable. And historically, she's not the only royal mistress to provoke scandal for doing so. Next, I meet another royal companion who found herself up on the stand for her dealings with the king.
Here we have Mary Ann Clark addressing the House of Commons. So all the sins of the world were being exposed here.
The story of 14th century Alice Perris makes it clear that, in the Middle Ages, being a wealthy and business-savvy royal mistress could make you pretty unpopular with the public. But even if you fast forward 400 years, society had become no kinder to women using their connections to the crown for their own gain. In 1809, Prince Frederick, Duke of York, found himself in the middle of a financial scandal which rocked the British establishment. And at the heart of it were some scandalous dealings by his mistress. Frederick was the second son of George III and had an important role in the military. I'm meeting Professor Matthew McCormack outside Horse Guards Parade, the historic headquarters of the army, to find out more about this Duke of York.
He was Commander-in-Chief of the Army from 1795. I think he was fairly popular. He was probably George III's favourite son. He was seen as a reformer and a moderniser within the army, so he had a pretty good reputation.
How, then, is this popular son, who tends to be doing pretty well, involved in this massive scandal? What happens?
Well, he becomes embroiled in an issue around the sale of military commissions.
In the early 19th century, it was standard military practice that you could pay money to obtain an officer commission and move up the ranks. But in 1809, it was revealed that some of these sales weren't going through the proper channels, and the Duke of York found himself in hot water when it was claimed he might be involved.
He became involved in the selling of military commissions by his mistress. People were coming to his mistress in order to buy a commission, and she was using her influence with him in order to acquire that. So there was a sense that there was some elite corruption going on.
Frederick's mistress, Mary Ann Clark, was offering backhanders for her own profit and for a cheaper rate, using her connections to turn an already seemingly corrupt system into a lucrative income stream for herself. The London Library holds some of the secrets as to who this crafty courtesan was and how her shady deals ended up being front-page news.
Welcome to one of my favourite places in the whole world. So, tell me, who was Mary Ann Clark?
Well, we have a picture of her here. It's the frontispiece of this book. So that's what she looked like.
Oh, very fashionable.
She came from fairly humble beginnings herself. Although she looks very glamorous here, she actually came from a kind of a trading background. She had been married to a stonemason, but clearly that wasn't the life for her. And she became a courtesan, so she became a kept woman. She was kind of supported by wealthy gentlemen. And by 1803, that was the Duke of York. She'd reached the very top of the tree.
So this looks like a fairly cushy number for her. What went wrong?
Well, eventually the money stops. So for a while, her lifestyle is being funded through the sale of commissions. He's paying her as a kind of an annuity in order to support her. But after a while, he cuts her off. And this causes a problem and presumably makes her rather jealous and out for revenge.
It might seem strange to modern ears for a mistress's income to be such a formal transaction. But for 18th century courtesans like Mary Ann Clark, these kind of arrangements were very much par for the course.
If you were intending to make your fortune as a courtesan or a kept woman or a mistress, the end goal was finding a very rich lover who would basically pay for your lifestyle, that they'd put you up in your own apartments, they'd pay for your clothes, they'd pay for your jewellery. But it was absolutely expected for a wealthy man to be able to do that. And not only expected, but it was actually a sort of a status symbol. It was an arrangement. It was. That doesn't mean that there wasn't genuine love, feeling and affection between them. Often there was. But what you have to remember is that women were in really, really precarious positions. They have been all throughout history. And if you make your money by basically being a professional mistress, you need some sense of security about that, which is why it was dealt with like a transaction, like a business deal, because the guy's got all the wealth, he's got all the power, he's got all the agency. And if he can just turn you out at a moment's notice, then you're in a lot of trouble.
When Mary Ann Clark found herself facing this dilemma, she hatched a plan. she decided to reveal to the nation that Frederick, Duke of York, had been involved in taking bribes from British officers.
There must have been some difficulty with breaking a story like this, though, because of all the very strict libel laws at the time, especially if you're dealing with a member of the royal family.
Absolutely. So the way that they could potentially get round that was if it was raised in Parliament, because then it would be covered by parliamentary privilege and it could also be reported freely in the newspapers. There was an MP called Colonel Gwilym Wardle, so he was himself from a kind of a military background and cared very much about this issue. And he kind of proposed a motion in Parliament that they should look into the conduct of the Duke of York regarding the sale of commissions. So as a result of this, Parliament conducted an investigation. He didn't have to attend himself, but Mary Ann Clark did.
How did she fare?
Well, she fared remarkably well. I mean, she was probably the only woman in the space, but nevertheless, she really stood up for herself, and we can get a sense of what kind of questioning she withstood in this source here. So, for example, somebody asks her, "Are you a married woman?" To which she replies, "You have no reason to doubt it." And upon the question being repeated, she says, "I am a married woman." And of course, everybody knows that she's a courtesan. But nevertheless, she's being quite kind of feisty in the way that she's dealing with these questions.
Absolutely. You have no reason to doubt it. It's my answer in the future.
The court case may have been carefully documented, but the way the public learnt about the scandal was chiefly through satirical cartoons, displayed in shopfront windows.
So, this is a caricature by James Gilray, probably the most famous caricaturist of the day. And here we have Mary Ann Clark addressing the House of Commons. So, as you can see, she's been depicted as Pandora opening her box.
Yeah.
So all the sins of the world were being exposed here. They're the opposition on that side, and they're loving it, as you can see. They're really, really enthusiastic about this. On the other hand, you've got the government benches, and the government are not enjoying it. They're holding their noses.
It feels that it's like an issue that's dividing the country.
Absolutely, yeah. Some people were very much on the side of the monarchy. Quite a lot of people were very critical of the corruption that was going on. So lots of petitions were submitted from people all over the country complaining about the trade in military commissions and the behaviour of the Duke of York. So it really did create a scandal and a very divisive issue.
And what were the repercussions of this? What happened to the Duke of York, for a start?
Well, for a while, it wasn't politic for him to carry on as Commander-in-Chief of the Army, but later he was reinstated after it had all blown over. Ultimately, the inquiry found in his favour. So they did not believe that commissions had been sold. So ultimately, he was legally off the hook, but nevertheless, it did really damage his reputation. This scandal tapped into this sense that the ruling classes were corrupt. This allowed the parliamentary reform movement to gain some momentum. I mean, the very fact that Parliament sided with the Duke and let him off suggested to many people that Parliament was unrepresentative.
Mary Ann Clark may not have triumphed in Parliament, but she remained a shrewd businesswoman to the end of her days. She wrote her own revealing memoirs and extracted huge pension payments from the government to keep them under wraps. And despite the official court verdict on the Duke of York's innocence, I have my doubts.
What in the end do you make of this? Do you think he was guilty?
I think he was certainly involved. I think the fact that the government, the royal family, paid so much money to Mary Ann Clark to keep her quiet, something was going on.
And what, in the end, do you think we should make of this whole affair?
I think it's quite interesting in terms of the reputation of public figures, because perhaps only a generation before, if you were, virtuous in your public life, you were good at your public office, but perhaps you had a mistress or your private life was perhaps a little more colourful, that was fine, because your public and your private life were very separate. By the time you get to the end of the 18th century, the beginning of the 19th century, people are paying much more attention to the moral quality of public men. And you're expected to be kind of moral in your private life as well as in your public life.
It's becoming much more like a modern way of seeing how a politician or how members of the civil service or the military should act.
Yes, absolutely. And in fact, it's quite a modern political scandal in that sense, because it concerns people's private lives. People were getting really interested in that.
The Mary Ann Clark affair does indeed feel almost like a modern-day tabloid story. So much so that it closely resembles a scandal involving another Duke of York, born almost 200 years later. When Sarah Ferguson, Duchess of York, became embroiled in a News of the World scandal, where she agreed to accept money for access to her ex-husband, Prince Andrew, it bore an eerie similarity to the conduct of Mary Ann Clark, taking backhand payments and capitalizing on her royal connections. Over time, our expectations of the royals have changed. Increasingly, we've started to question not just how much our monarchs are spending, but the morality of exactly what they are spending it on. And it feels like the country could be at a crossroads when it comes to royal spending.
It's a fine line. Nowadays, we don't want our monarchs to be frivolous or extravagant, but neither do we want them to wear tracksuit bottoms. We want them to look the part, but we won't tolerate what we perceive to be obscene expenditure. It's rather a double bind. In the end, I think that whatever they do, whether it's justified or not, we'll find something to criticise.